Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So today's lecture video we are going to talk about the self. And so we're going to introduce the idea of a self-concept and talk about all the things that influence the way that we see ourselves. We're also going to talk about motivation. So we'll talk a little bit about why we do what we do. So after today's lecture video, you will have all the material for exam 1. So this is going to be a busy week. So we will have our usual lecture video and activity. So activity 3 will be due by Friday at 5 p.m. But also, in addition to that, we will have a review video where I will talk about the study guide. Now, the review video is not required. It doesn't introduce any new material, but I think it's helpful just to have a nice review of the material before you take the test. And then also, there will be a practice exam. Now, the practice exam can get you a little bit of extra credit, but the main benefit to the practice exam is being able to see what kinds of questions might be on the test and helping you prepare. So the practice exam and exam 1 will both be released at noon on February 8th and will be available until noon on February 15th. Okay, so that's 12 p.m. So just make sure that you take the test at some point during that time. Now, we will talk about the test in the review video, the information in the syllabus, but if you have any questions, let me know. I will be 50 questions. You'll have 75 minutes to take it. Multiple choice, true, false, matching. So just let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture today. Alright, so today we are going to talk about the self, and we're going to talk about ways that we understand ourselves. So, first of all, talking about the origins of the self and our self-concept, it says that it does occur in some primates and begins in humans at about age 2. So one thing that they will do to try to see if we have a concept of the self, in other words, to think of ourselves as our own unique entity here, is that they will take primates, if we're talking about primates, or also very young children, babies, and they will put a mark on their foreheads, right? And then they will put them in a mirror, and they will let them see themselves. If they have a concept of themselves, then they will try to wipe the mark off of their own forehead. If they don't understand that it is them in the mirror, they will try to wipe the mark off of the forehead of the mirror, right? They'll rub on the mirror and try to take it off of their reflection rather than on themselves. And that's a way that we measure whether or not we have started to understand that we are something unique and something different and separate, right? So when we're talking about children's self-concept or the way that they see themselves and think about themselves, it tends to be very concrete. If you ask my son is 5, if you ask him who he is, depending on what day it is, he would tell you, I'm Christian, I'm 5, I'm Spider-Man, I like superheroes, he's big into the superheroes, he has green eyes, he would tell you something like that, right? He would tell you about his hobbies or about things that he likes to do, people that he plays with, right? That's part of his very concrete self-concept. As we get older, though, our self-concept matures. We put less of an emphasis on physical characteristics and more on who we are as a person, our psychological preferences, things about how we see ourselves, right? So, for example, if you ask me who I am, I'm not going to say that, well, I have brown hair and I'm a girl, right? If you ask me who I am, I'm going to say that I am a mother and I am a teacher, and I'll tell you about my personality and I'll tell you about the things that bring me fulfillment, right? A little bit more abstract, a little bit less concrete as we age. But we all have some concept of ourselves about what it is that makes us unique and what makes us different, right? So this is an example of what I was talking about earlier with putting the babies in front of the mirrors, right? And somehow, as a psychologist, I never did this with my kids. I think I meant to. I thought about doing it, but I never did actually do it with seeing if they would try to clean the mark off of themselves or off of the mirror, right? Obviously, they're too old to do that now. But that's one way that we see whether or not we have developed kind of a view of ourselves as something separate, right? So today we're going to talk about some things that influence the way that we see ourselves or our self-concept. And so one thing that plays a large role in how we see ourselves is our culture, right? A culture, of course, being an example of nurture, being an example of our environment. Think about how we might be different if we grew up in another culture, right? Because each culture has different values and it has different ways of looking at ourselves and looking at other people. And so one thing that we've already touched on a bit and that we're about to talk about more is the type of culture being individualistic or collectivist, right? And so an example, an introduction to that here we see some proverbs or some sayings for different cultures. In our culture, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? What we're saying is that if we want something or we need something, we have to go after it and we have to get it, right? And then we'll get what we need. Japanese proverb here, the nail that stands out gets pounded down, right? The emphasis here being on that we need to blend in with other people, that we need to work as part of a group rather than as individuals. This kind of gives you a way of thinking about how our culture teaches us to think, right? It says the independent view of the self. In many Western cultures, people have an independent view, independent or individualistic view of the self, right? That we tend to think of ourselves as independent and that what we think and what we do and what we feel is all about us, right? That's not to say that we don't have relationships and that we don't value relationships. We do. But we tend to think of things differently, that we think more about our own personal happiness. And this may possibly be related to divorce rate, because you will actually find that independent or individualistic cultures are going to have higher divorce rates than collectivist cultures do. And perhaps one reason could be that we tend to think more about our own happiness and we focus a little bit less on the happiness of other people, right? But it says a way of defining oneself in terms of one's own internal thoughts, feelings, and actions. So I see who I am as my own achievements and my own personality and my own perspective rather than my role as part of a larger group, right? So we tend to define ourselves as separate from other people. That's not to say that we don't have relationships, as I said, but what it means is that we feel like we are complete in and of ourselves, typically, or we are more so than someone in another culture would be. And therefore, we value independence and uniqueness, right? We feel like we want to be special. We want to stand out. We want to be different, right? In a good way, but we want to be different. We want to be acknowledged for who we are as a different, unique individual. And we want other people to see us this way as well. This is going to be very different from an interdependent or collectivist view of the self or culture. It says many Asian and other non-Western cultures have an interdependent view, which is basically defining oneself in the terms of one's relationships to other people, right? And so then group membership becomes the most important thing, right? So we think of who we are as part of the groups that we are part of, right? Part of our circle of friends, part of our family, part of our nation, right? All of these things are important as group membership, more so than our own individual benefits, right? Our own individual achievements, right? It says recognizing that one's behavior is often determined by the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. And so in a collectivist culture, they may be a little bit more likely to take these things into account, the thoughts and feelings of other people, right? In these kinds of cultures, connectedness and interdependence are going to be valued. And so it's going to be extremely important not to be isolated in these kinds of cultures. That it's not about this independence and uniqueness. In fact, that's going to be frowned upon. It is that you are useful if you blend in with other people and if you provide a benefit or a service to the group, right? So you play a role within the group, and that the benefit of the group is the benefit to you as well, right? Less so than your own individual achievement. Now, it's not to say that one culture is better than another. It's just that they are different. But you can see that if you were raised in a different culture, then you might have a totally different picture of yourself. Now, just a caveat here. It says not all Westerners are independent and not all Easterners are interdependent. So certainly, then, there are individual differences within each kind of culture. And we're going to talk about a few of these in a minute, but not everyone in our culture is going to be independent or individualistic, and not everyone in a collectivist culture is going to be collectivist or interdependent, right? There's going to be individual differences, right? It says within cultures there are differences in the self-concept, where there'll be some people who are more collectivist and some who are less collectivist. Within a culture, this is kind of a broad generalization, but there are always exceptions, okay? So, now that we've talked a little bit about culture, we're about to talk about gender. And so when we talk about gender and how gender is an important part of ourself, I'd like to do an activity here. So activity 3, the activity for this week, what are the strengths of women and what are the weaknesses of women? As well as the strengths of men and the weaknesses of men. So give me some things here that we think are stereotypically good things about women, negative things about women, good things about men, negative things about men. And then I want you to tell me, how accurate are gender stereotypes and where do they come from? So we're about to talk about gender and how gender plays an important role in how we perceive ourselves, but I'm interested in how you guys feel about these stereotypes, whether or not you think they're accurate. Do we have these stereotypes because they're true, because we have seen them over and over again and they're true? Or where do they come from, right? Do they come from the media, from our society? So I want to get your thoughts on gender this week. Now, when we're talking about gender differences and defining the self, men and women are going to define themselves differently, right? So some gender stereotypes here. Women talk about interpersonal problems and relationships. Men talk about anything but their feelings. Actually, a funny note here, I left these slides open one day that I was looking at them, and my husband came by and added the duck hunting part. The slides did say usually sports, and my husband came in and added the duck hunting. So you can see it's male-female difference there. Excellent. But we have these stereotypes. This is just one example. There are tons of others, and so I look forward to reading about those in your responses, in your activities this week. But there are a lot of stereotypes about how men and women are different, right? Starting in early childhood, American girls are more likely to develop intimate relationships or intimate friendships and cooperate with others. Perhaps then, when we're talking about gender differences, women are a little bit more likely to be collectivist in their mindset or more focused on groups, whereas boys or men are a little bit more likely to be a little bit more individualistic in their achievements or in their focus on themselves. Although we'll get to this in a second about the group memberships with the boys. But girls do tend to think of themselves as part of their self-concept is their relationships, right? So I'm so-and-so's best friend. Like, if you asked me really to define myself and who I am, I would say I'm a Christian, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm an instructor. All of those things are about relationships, right? And so perhaps women tend to focus more on relationships, especially close, intimate relationships, and to have maybe a couple of really like best friends and have a need for that, and maybe a little bit more. It says boys are more likely to focus on group memberships, like, for example, being part of a team, or being part of a fraternity, being part of a larger group. So girls are focused more on smaller groups with more meaningful, fewer, higher quality, perhaps relationships, whereas boys are more focused on their group memberships and being part of a team or a unit, right? And so I'm wondering why this is. I'm wondering if this is nature or nurture. That there's just something about the genetics of girls and boys that makes them different, or if it is perhaps the way that we parent girls and boys differently. And we absolutely do parent boys and girls differently, and I imagine nurture probably plays a large role in this. So it says that women tend to focus on relational interdependence. They focus on their close relationships. So often, if you ask a woman what's most important to her, she would tell you about the few close relationships to her, like perhaps her marriage or her children, her best friend, right? Men also value those things, and it's not to say that men don't, but they have typically more of a collective interdependence, which means they focus more on their memberships in larger groups, right? So something at work, they're part of their work group, or part of a team, or part of a club, something like that, a larger group. So women may be focusing on more one-on-one relationships, whereas men's relationships tend to be larger in groups. And once again, perhaps this is just a cultural influence here. Actually, psychologically, men and women are much more similar than they are different. So when we talk about gender stereotypes, we often find ourselves feeling like men are from Mars and women are from Venus, right? But actually, psychologically, men and women are more similar than they are different, right? So sometimes we spend maybe a lot of attention on the ways that men and women are different. But men and women both value relationships. Men and women both go through a lot of these things that we're going to be talking about. Maybe the way that they experience it or the way they talk about it is a little bit different, but they have a lot of the same experiences, right? It says relative differences in the way women and men define themselves in the USA. Women do tend to have a greater sense of relational interdependence, as we've said, whereas men have more of a collective interdependence or more focused on groups. But overall, men and women are very similar. Men still value those close relationships as well. Women still value their place in larger groups as well. And so there's always a lot more similarity than there is differences between genders. Actually, there's much more difference within a gender than there is between the genders. So if you take any two women, they're likely to be very different from each other, or any two men are likely to be very different from each other, right? But as a whole, men and women are not that different. All right, so talking about the way that we see ourselves, impression management is very important here. Impression management is the attempt by people to get others to see them as they want to be seen. So we all have a certain amount of impression management, sometimes more than others, where we really want other people to see us a certain way. So there are a lot of different ways that we can do this. We could do this by perhaps controlling the things that we say or the things that we wear in a certain environment, right? Perhaps we try to focus on what do we put on social media and that kind of thing. We try to control the impression that other people have of us, because it's very important for us to maintain self-esteem. It's important for us to feel like other people like us and other people see us the way we want to be seen. There are a lot of different ways that we engage in impression management, and perhaps we're not always aware of it when we're doing it, right? One way that we do it, ingratiation, flattering, praising, and generally trying to make ourselves likable to another person, often of higher status. You guys know what I'm talking about here. We're brown-nosing a little bit, right? But we tend to do this, right? Why is it that we praise other people? Sometimes it's because we're genuinely, like, you're doing a great job and we're really excited about it. But sometimes it's because we want them to like us, right? People like other people who praise them. And sometimes, if it's a person of a higher status, then we are trying to maybe get a benefit ourselves from doing this. But one way that we control our impression is by kind of sucking up to other people. I'm sorry, but there it is, sucking up. The next one, self-handicapping. It says creating obstacles and excuses for ourselves. So we said last week when we were talking about attributions that it was important for us to feel like we can take credit for our successes, but we can push the blame for our failures off on someone else. And so with self-handicapping, what we're doing is we're building in an excuse for ourselves so that if we don't do well in a task, we can avoid blaming ourselves. There are a couple types of self-handicapping here: behavioral self-handicapping and reported self-handicapping. Now, with behavioral self-handicapping, what you're doing is you are literally doing something that you know could harm yourself or could harm your outcomes, right? For example, pulling an all-nighter before a test. Guys, don't pull all-nighters before tests. It's just not a good idea. You need your sleep to be able to function, right? To be able to do a good job on the test. And so if you perhaps stay up all night and then you don't do well on a test, you can say, well, I didn't do well because I was tired. You still didn't do well, but you have a built-in excuse now so that you don't have to feel bad about yourself. Sometimes we do this on purpose. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it. Reported self-handicapping would be where we do this with our classmates or our teachers because we don't want them to think that we didn't do a good job. So we've all maybe done this before a test, like, I haven't had a chance to study much, my dog's been sick, or whatever. We kind of say something to our classmates or our teachers like, I just haven't had a chance to study, or I've been feeling so sick. Because that way, if we don't do well, if our classmate sees our grade or the teacher sees the grades, then they'll cut us some slack, right? So with this reported self-handicapping, we're trying to give ourselves an excuse, right? In both situations with self-handicapping, we may not even realize that we're doing it, but what we're trying to do is to protect our self-esteem here. And this is one way that we manage our impression. Now, impression management is a cultural universal, and what this means is that it is found just about everywhere that people try to manage their impression. Now, the way that we do it depends on our culture. There are certain things about our impression that are important in our culture, right? We said we want to be independent. We want to be unique. We want to take take credit for successes. We want to avoid the blame for failures. There are a lot of things that are particularly important in our culture. Other cultures would have different ways of managing their impression. For example, saving face, right, or not being blamed for something, having an excuse, might be more important in other cultures than it is in ours. And so the way that we manage our impression may vary depending on the culture, but the desire to manage our impression is present in every culture that we found, right? So think about how politicians do this, and they all do this. They want the public to see them a certain way, and that's not always accurate, right? It says that JFK wanted everyone to think of himself as a very healthy man, but he actually suffered from a degenerative bone disease and chronic back pain. Well, we didn't know that, right? Why is it that the president didn't share that information? Well, he probably didn't want to look weak, right? And so politicians want to portray themselves as strong and as invincible and as the kind of person you wouldn't want to mess with. And I suppose, as a culture, we want our leader to have those characteristics, and later in the class we'll talk about leadership, and we feel like perhaps maybe there's some characteristics that are important in leadership. But certainly, if your whole career is based on your image, which with politicians their career really is based on their image, then you might engage in more impression management than you would in another career, right? But individuals here are trying to maintain their career by managing their impression. So all of this, talking about ourselves, is related to our self-esteem and how we feel about ourselves, right? So our self-esteem is our overall evaluation that we have of ourselves. And most people tend to have a positive view of themselves, right? Overall, a lot of people would say there are more good things about themselves than there are negative things. There's a reason that high self-esteem is important. It's a protective function because, as we've said previously, people who are depressed often have low self-esteem. And so having high self-esteem and feeling good about ourselves, it's important for our psychological health, to the point that, as we talk about cognitive dissonance later, we might manipulate the way that we think about things to try to maintain our self-esteem because it does protect us from some negative psychological outcomes. But also, having high self-esteem has a motivational function. If we feel like we are good people and we are competent, that might lead us to try new things or to try harder. People who have low self-esteem might not try, might not put forth much effort. And then also people who have high self-esteem are going to be motivated to keep their self-esteem high, so they'll be trying to continue succeeding. So self-esteem is a very good thing. However, it can become excessive, and this is where we have something called narcissism. Narcissism is a combination of excessive self-love and a lack of empathy toward others. Basically, the individual who is narcissistic is one who not only do they really, really like themselves, but they are not capable of seeing other people's perspectives. And so that's normal in kids. It's very difficult for young children to take other people's perspectives. They haven't learned that skill yet. But if we're talking about someone who is an adult, who is just completely oblivious to the impact they have on other people, and maybe you know some of these people, it's very difficult to be around this person because they not only are very high on themselves, but they have no idea how they impact other people, right? And research says that this is increasing in our society, particularly in college students and college student age individuals, that this is going up. And of course, the name of narcissism comes from Greek mythology, Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection. So he saw his reflection in a pool, and it was so beautiful that he could not leave it. And therefore, of course, couldn't go to get food and the things that he needed, and ended up dying, right? Of course, this is just mythology, but the idea is that we harm ourselves by being narcissistic, by being obsessed with ourselves, right? So just a little bit of information about that there. All right, and then the last thing we're going to talk about today is motivation. And so we're going to talk about the different kinds of motivation and how to maintain motivation. There are several different kinds of motivation. We're really just going to talk about two, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is the desire to engage in an activity because we enjoy it, right? So think about the things that you do just because you want to, right? Maybe you have a hobby that you enjoy or something that you just do because you like doing it. You're not doing it because anybody makes you do it or because of some kind of reward that you get for it. You're doing it because you like it. This is very different from extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation means that we do something because we feel like we have to, we feel pressured into it, or because perhaps we're getting paid for it, right? So think about education. I mean, why is it that you guys are taking classes? Probably often a mixture of both, in that we do have intrinsic motivation. There are some classes that we enjoy, and maybe those are related to our field we like a little bit better than some others. But there's certainly going to be classes where we're more extrinsically motivated. We just want to make the grade, and that's the most important thing. And so there's nothing wrong with extrinsic motivation. There's nothing wrong with doing something because it needs to be done. I mean, certainly if we didn't have extrinsic motivation, there are a lot of things that wouldn't get done. The problem is that if we're talking about something like education, we want our students to enjoy classes. We want our students to enjoy doing these things, and so it's important to maintain intrinsic motivation, right? So that leads us then to the question about reward programs. A lot of individuals use reward programs for schools, for reading books or for getting good grades. Parents do this, teachers do this. So there is a controversy here about whether or not we should be rewarding students for doing well in school, and whether or not that undermines their motivation, right? It says many teachers or parents reward kids for good grades with compliments, candy, gold stars, or toys, or for reading books and things like that. So I'm going to tell you my perspective as well as what the textbook talks about, and there's really a lot of controversy here. I think that using rewards is okay as long as it's used in moderation, and I think that certain kinds of rewards are better than others, like compliments and praise is a good thing, right? I feel like giving, especially with young kids, positive reinforcement, praising them is good. It can become excessive, though, if you're doing too much. And so it could undermine your motivation if you do it the wrong way, right? We want the rewards to be appropriate, obviously, right? And when we're talking about these rewards, the book talks about how we have to consider the effect of rewards on people's thoughts. It is certainly dangerous, perhaps, to do reward programs if someone stops doing something because they love doing it and starts doing it just to get the rewards, right? Because if we're rewarding kids for doing their reading, for example, then we are perhaps telling them that reading itself is not rewarding, that you should do this for an extrinsic reason. And maybe if they start doing it for extrinsic reasons, they'll stop doing it for intrinsic reasons or motivations, right? This is a concern, because if we're talking about something like reading, obviously that's very important, and students that love reading are more likely to do well in school and to be, lifelong learners. And so then the worry is that if we give too many rewards, or if we get too excessive with it, then children will stop reading for intrinsic reasons if they don't get the rewards. This is certainly a possibility that this could happen, but some things to keep in mind here. One thing that is related to this issue is the over-justification effect. The tendency of people to view their behavior as caused by compelling extrinsic reasons, making them underestimate the extent to which it was caused by intrinsic reasons. So, if you are getting a large extrinsic reward for something, and you are asking the person, why are you doing what you're doing, they are likely to say, I'm doing it because of the reward, rather than they're doing it because they want to, right? We just tend to do this. And so then, if we are giving children large rewards for reading, for example, and then we say, why are you reading? They'll say, well, I'm reading to get the reward. Why? Because a large reward is very salient. In other words, it sticks out. We think about that. And so kids especially will say, okay, I want that reward. That's why I'm doing it. I think that it is okay to give small rewards or moderate rewards here, and making sure that we're giving compliments and we're letting them know that we're proud. It is important to be enthusiastic about reading and to have your kids know that you are excited that they're reading. We just want to make sure that we're not giving rewards that are too excessive because of this over-justification effect. So also what happens here is we often see this with people who start doing something for a career that they were previously doing for a hobby. They will actually enjoy it a little bit less. So for example, if someone is playing football and they have gone from playing football as an amateur to playing football as a professional, they tend to say that they actually have a little bit less of an intrinsic motivation. That's probably because of the large, compelling extrinsic motivation. I mean, football players get paid a large amount of money to do what they do, and so they would be more likely to say that they're doing it for the extrinsic motivation rather than for the intrinsic motivation. So how are we going to avoid the over-justification effect? Well, first of all, it says rewards will only undermine interest if interest was initially high. So if you have a child who hates reading, then you're not going to undermine their intrinsic motivation. So giving them rewards is not actually going to hurt anything. It could only make them a little bit more motivated. Even if it's an extrinsic kind of motivation, it's better than no motivation at all, right? It also says the type of reward makes a difference. So you're going to see that there are multiple types of rewards, and one type is going to be better than another, right? So task contingent rewards are rewards that are given if you complete the task, regardless of how well you do it. On the other hand, performance contingent rewards are rewards that are based on how well we do a task. And so performance contingent rewards will maintain that motivation longer because even though you still are getting a reward for it, it's based on how well you do it. And so there's still a drive there to get better and better and better, okay? So when we're talking about giving rewards, it's important to give a reward that is appropriate. So we don't want to give a reward that is excessive. We also don't want to give a reward that is task contingent or you just have to do it. We want to give a reward that is based on performance that will help keep them motivated, okay? So that is the end of lecture for today. So after this lecture, you have everything that you need to be successful on exam 1. And so if you have any questions about the material, please let me know. I will also be posting a review video where I talk about the study guide. So look for the review video, look over the study guide, and just let me know if you have any questions. You guys have a great day.